everyone, and welcome to the Extraordinarily Ordinary. Today, our guest is Miss Dee Edwards. She is a mental health practitioner with 27 years experience working with families of murder victims. Welcome, Dee, to my show.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're all the way from Wales, right?
Yeah, North Wales, yes.
You've worked with families of murder victims before. What are the examples of violent crimes that have the biggest impact on families left behind by murder victims?
Well, of course, all crime causes problems for people, but obviously murder's the worst because if you're attacked, you will always worry about it. People are traumatized by the attacks that they suffer. Even if your car's been stolen or your window's been smashed, it still affects people. But when if you've been attacked, you can recover mentally and physically. Of course, not everybody does. If somebody's house is burgled, you're always scared of being in that house. When you've had a child or somebody else that you love murdered, there isn't any going back. That person has gone forever, and that has a huge impact on not just mental health, but physical health. People are really traumatized. Each murder affects at least 100 other people. There's like a ripple effect. It affects communities. People are scared to go out. But for the families, their fear is always, especially because I don't know about what the crime sentencing is where you live, but certainly in the UK, it's very poor. People can commit murder, horrendous murders, with a lot of violence, and yet they are still released sometimes as soon as 8 to 10 years. There was a time, we don't have a death sentence in this country anymore. People had the death penalty. That was taken away. We had a Home Secretary years ago called Jack Straw, and he signed away the right to ever reintroduce the death penalty into this country. Just in the last month, 21 teenagers have been stabbed to death in London. When I was a girl, there wasn't 21 murders in a year that we knew of. Obviously, with up-to-date news that we have now, it's easier communications around the world, so you do hear more. But when I started, because a little boy called James Bulger was missing, I was going to a racing car show with my friend. We heard on the news that James Bulger was missing. We were very worried. He was only 2 years old. And 2 days later, on our way home, we heard that he'd been found dead on a railway line. And it was a huge shock to everybody around the world, I believe, not just in the UK, that the people that killed that little boy were 2 10-year-olds. Now, originally they did get a very long sentence, but it was cut to 10 years. They didn't just murder him. I'm not going to go into details, obviously, but they tortured him. The next day, we heard 2 ladies called Charlie Rose and Julie Hearn talking with on Radio 2, talking about they were setting up an organisation called Mothers Against Murder and Aggression, and did anyone want to help them? And given the impact of the news, we thought loads of people would be ringing to join them. But actually, my friend Linda Keane and I were the only 2 people that rang. Between the 4 of us, we set up the organisation. We held a vigil in Liverpool, which hundreds of people attended. And then from that, we did press releases. We all worked with press people. We all did, press releases for different things in our own jobs. It overtook our lives. We didn't realise the impact. Within a couple of months, the other 3 ladies had gone back to work, and I felt very differently from them. While they were all very upset about what happened to James, I was angry. I was upset, of course, but I was very angry. And for me, I thought that they should go to prison for the rest of their lives. The other ladies didn't, and that's their opinion. Anyway, they went back to their jobs. I met a lady called Lynn Costello and her husband Roger, and it was us that changed the laws and did all the work together. And we worked together from 1994 until 2016, and we ran Mothers Against Murder and Aggression and travelled all over the country. We met absolutely hundreds of families. We campaigned with them. We met other families that were already campaigning. The difference with us was we hadn't had a child murdered. all of the other families had. And we walked from Dunblane to London to try and raise money for families of murder victims, to build a retreat where they could go for respite care. And we went to Dunblane because, I don't know if you know about Dunblane, but lots of children were murdered there in school. They were average age of 5 years old, and a man went in early one morning and shot dead all the children. And it was awful. It was awful. And so we met the families there and asked if we could have permission to go up there. And from then we just ended up, we never got funded. We were writing to the government, we were writing to charities, we didn't get any funding. So we used to drive around to car boot sales at the weekend, standing in muddy fields, selling whatever people had donated to us to keep us going, to pay for our petrol. And then eventually, when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister and David Blunkett was the Home Secretary, we wrote to them. We didn't hear back at first, but we pestered them so much and we bombarded them with emails and phone calls to their offices. They invited us in, and with other families whose children had been murdered, we became the advisory panel for the Home Office, and also to a lot of the Association of Chief Police Officers. We worked with them as well. We just campaigned to change laws for longer sentencing, for better care for families, because very often as soon as a court case is over, they're just forgotten about and they're just expected to get on with their lives. And of course they can't, because they don't just suffer the heartbreak and the loss of their child, and sometimes their children have never been found. They're still at a loss. And a lady called Mary McCourt, her daughter Helen was murdered on the way home from work. They couldn't find her. I think it's over 30 years ago now. They've never found Helen. But her mum campaigned to have a law brought in that the man who killed Helen, at the end of his sentence, he was not allowed to leave prison until he until he told her where Helen was buried. And so it took her till about 5 years ago to even get the campaign underway that was supported then by the government. And last year they did bring in the law that you cannot leave prison. For every day that you don't say where the body is buried, you get an extra day on your sentence. So that was brought in earlier this year. That law was brought into force in the UK, but they released the man 2 weeks before that law came in. Helen's work has helped a lot of people for the future. The man who killed her daughter will never have to reveal where she is because he's a free man now. So
you mentioned that because of the law, it even makes the trauma worse for the families of murder.
Of course it does.
Is there any other aspect that may exacerbate the trauma to the families of murder victims? Maybe the criminal justice system, the publicity and the press, maybe?
Press. The press tell their side of the story as they see it, which probably happens around the world. Well, we know it does. They never tell a full story, and very often they get it very wrong. The parole board really impact on families of murder victims because they think everybody deserves a second chance, despite how awful the murder is, despite what they've done. They take into consideration the background of the murderer. They always came from a bad home. They weren't well educated. And yes, in lots of cases, people do live in rough areas, but there is many, probably just as many people who live in affluent areas who are very, very well off, live in big houses, live in really nice places. That doesn't mean they don't murder. And unfortunately, the press really go to town on the people who come from social housing, council estates, poor areas. They rip into that family. They want to try and find out stuff about them as if it's their fault that their child died, because
so
they have this
victim blaming now.
Exactly, because they're always people who live in a really nice area, the upper classes. The one thing the press do with them, they were living in their £550,000 house, as if that makes any difference. But when you live in social houses in deprived areas where there's mass unemployment, mass poverty, those people are treated like, well, what do you expect on that estate? You know, what do you expect? That is what they expect. They don't expect to live very long. It's totally wrong. There are I lived on a massive council estate in London years ago. There was over 850 houses, and I think probably less than 5-10% of the people on there were rough, didn't care, didn't look after their kids, let them do whatever they wanted, cared more about the trainers and how much they cost that they had on their feet than what they were carrying in their pockets. But the biggest percentage of people on there were great and looked after each other. So yeah, the justice system, the press are awful, the justice system is bad, the probation service and the parole board seem to think that, well, the parole board's like a revolving door of letting people out all the time. There is absolutely no justice for murder victims in this country.
What are the symptoms, the common symptoms of trauma that these families of murder victims experience?
PTSD. They're scared to go out. All their awareness of everything is heightened. Who's behind me? Scared to go out of their homes. Obviously, I mean, a lot of them end up, even the parents can't talk to each other. They suffer a trauma. A lot of families of murder victims, the parents are ripped apart. They can't talk to each other. If one of them is having a slightly bad day, they don't even want to smile in case the other half is, what have you got to smile about? Our son or daughter is dead, you know. They end up not communicating. They might turn to drink. They have really bad anxiety. They're terrified that if the person who killed their child comes out of prison, are they going to come and kill their other child or their other children? They can't sleep. They don't eat properly. They're constantly in fear of everything. They have nightmares. You know, it's not just mental health, their physical health suffers because their mental health is so bad.
Just now you said one murder affects 100 other people, but also it affects them for a lifetime. It's not something temporary, but for the rest of their lives.
Forever. I mean, in the time that I've been doing this, a lot of the families that we met years ago, they were young couples. They had great children. They were, went out and did stuff together. Their children were doing well at school. And a really awful example, we have these friends, Margaret and Jim Watson. They lived up in Scotland. Their daughter was stabbed to death in the school playground by another pupil. When she went to court, she got 8 years. The Marie Claire magazine wrote an article about her, as if she was the good guy, and the girl that she killed, Diane, she was only 16, Diane Watson, and her friends carried her home. Her parents lived in a flat next door to the school, and they carried her home, and she died in her father's arms on the doorstep. And less than a year later, her only other sibling, her brother Alan, took his own life. Completely destroyed those people, and they spent the rest of their life campaigning for justice for not just their children but for other children. The girl that killed, she was released after 8 years. She can get married, she can have children, she can have grandchildren. All of that stopped for Margaret and Jim 30 years ago. Jim died the year before last, and Margaret died earlier this year. And that is a lot of families, a lot of people that we've worked with have died in their 40s. They were living perfectly normal lives, jobs, children, homes, parties, Christmas. Christmas is never the same again. There's always an empty chair. Easter, school plays, everything is impacted on, and there's nothing they can do about it. And the only help, they don't get help from the justice system at all. The only help they get is the support from other families.
You also mentioned that when the murder victims come from rough neighborhoods, that's when the victim blaming also often happens. So do the families left behind also face stigma from the community that they live in after the murder?
It depends. If sometimes, like if the aggressor lives on that estate, you might get their family, talking about them. On the whole, communities pull together, but then I think in the beginning they really do pull together and they support them. But over time, I don't think people mean to be unkind to them, but I have heard people say, oh my God, she's still going on about that, it was 10 years ago. But that's because they're not in that position, and you can say that to them. But you get things like, Lynn and I were visiting a family on an estate in London, and their 2 little daughters came down to the shops with us, and there was a block of flats with a high-rise block, and on the 3rd floor the window was smashed and you could see into the stairwell, and there was blood all over the windows. And I said to the little girls, oh, don't look. And they said, oh, we've been looking at that for weeks. A man was shot dead on those stairs, but the police haven't been and cleaned the blood off. Now, you can guarantee if that was a flat in Mayfair and that happened, it would have been cleaned off immediately. Then we worked with a family, Jenny and Tony. They'd gone on holiday. When they got home, they found their son had been stabbed to death in their house. And obviously not very nice. There was all blood in the kitchen. They phoned the police. 3 days later, they were still living in their car because they didn't want to go in the house because nobody came to clean the blood up in the kitchen. They didn't want to go in there and do it themselves. They didn't have anyone who could help them.
Yeah.
You know, nowadays things have changed. They would have been better supported. They would have been given somewhere to stay while it was cleaned. But back then it wasn't done. And when they did, we have a company in this country, I don't know if you have it, but in the UK we have a company called Rent a Kill. They go in and they kill rats and pests and stuff like that.
Yeah, we do.
And yeah, you have Rent a Kill.
Yes.
So here, their son was laying dead in that house for 3 days. They came home, they lived in their car, and the police, nobody came to clean that house. And I think one of the neighbours rang the police and said, you've got to do something. This family are totally traumatized. They've been left to deal with this on their own. And they sent someone to clean the house, and it was Rent a Kill.
All right. What about family members that have to be a witness in the court case, or where they have to relive their trauma again and again through interrogations, investigations, and also in the court proceeding itself? So is the trauma even worse for them when they have to relive it over and over and over again?
I think so, yes, because it's obviously not something they want to deal with. You're still in shock. You're still trying to deal with the impact of losing your loved one. And yes, it's terrible. There was, I think, the couple whose son was killed in the house. They had to give evidence. They had to be in 2 separate, well, they were put in cells actually because there's nowhere else to put them. And the lady wouldn't sit down. She had somebody in the cell and they said, you can sit down, and she said, I can't. How do I know this isn't the cell that my son's murderer sat in? And she was totally traumatized, and she said, I can't give evidence, I'm too scared, his family are there, what if they come after us? She was really panicking. And the judge said he would charge her with contempt of court unless she came to give evidence. And this is the victim's mother.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, I cannot imagine. I mean, she's already grieving the loss.
Yeah.
And then she has to force herself to actually talk about it again and again. I mean, I'm sure her lawyer, she went through everything with her lawyer, with the police and everything, and she had to tell it all again to the court. Yeah. And
it's hard enough when you're giving evidence for the defense, but when the murderer is there and his solicitor, his lawyer is doing the questioning, they're really tough on the families. Really tough. There's some of them are compassionate enough and apologize and say, I have to ask these questions. But a lot of times that doesn't happen. You know, too often the victims are the people that don't get the support, whereas the killer gets lots of support. You know, and you get some of the killer, the murderers' families in the gallery screaming and shouting abuse. And yes, they do get taken out eventually, but that happens an awful lot as well. And also it's difficult for, you know, the person who's done the murder, their family might be a really nice family, and I've sat in court with people where the family of the murderers are absolutely distraught that their child has done this. You know, some people don't set out to murder, but done in an instant, but it's still murder and you should still be punished for it.
What are the treatments available for violent crime survivors or the family members of murder victims?
Not as much as there should be. Not everybody gets help. They really don't. And I think it all comes down to money. That's what they always say. We haven't got the money to do this. However, there are some really fantastic groups doing amazing work. There's a lot of really good work goes on. Much more than there used to be, but there's still not enough. When you think of the fact 21 teenage boys have been murdered in London in the last month. That's 21 families. Last month, yes. 21 teenagers in a month. Yeah. And so, you know, there's 21 new families just last week. I mean, there are really fantastic groups all over the country that have set up and are working together. My friend Teresa, she lives up in Newcastle area, Middlesbrough. Her son was murdered over 20 years ago. She had a 4-year-old son. She has worked with victims since the day Chris was killed and brought Tom up on her own. She runs a group, the Chris Cave Foundation. There's lots of families support after murder and manslaughter, but generally the help and the resources come from families. There are things that like Victim Support is a government-run charity. They don't do as much as what other families do, but again, in fairness, there are so many murders.
So what can the family and friends of violent crime survivors do to support them?
Usually it's a hug and a cup of tea and a chat, and just to be there to listen, no matter how many times they want to talk about it. You know, people will say, oh, I talked to them about it and I talk to them again, and months later they still want to talk. Yes, they do want to talk because they want to keep their child's life alive. They don't want to be part of a ripple pond. They want to be able to talk about their child whenever they want, for as long as they want. And yeah, people might think, oh God, here we go again. But imagine yourself on the other side, you know. But lots of people, the main thing is just listening to them and just be there and let people know that you do care, because you know what, tomorrow that knock on the door from the police might be your child. It might be you that's thrown into that situation. And things like, you know, do you want me to get some shopping? Do you want me to cook you a meal? Some people just turn up with a meal. Here's your dinner tonight. You haven't got to worry about that. There are people who will say straight away, that's it, I'm going to go out and do something, and they will campaign and they will change laws and they get people on their side and they will not take no for an answer. And that's what we did when we went to the government. We went to the Home Office and sat downstairs. We are not moving until we get an appointment. We are not going anywhere. You will listen to us because we are speaking on behalf of 500 families. And that's how we got to be part of Tony Blair's advisory panel.
Do you think, okay, this is a rather sensitive question, because of the lenient punishment to the murderers, do you think that a harsher punishment or bringing back the death sentence, the death penalty, would provide more relief to the families of murder victims, or do you think it won't make any difference?
For the murder victims' families, if the person that killed their child or their husband, their mother, whatever, they're never going to be over it, never. But if they knew that the person was put to death, there's no way that person's ever going to come out and kill somebody again. Mm-hmm. The thing that people would be happy with in all of this is that if you kill somebody, you never come out of prison. Never. You stay in there for the rest of your life. That is real punishment. For me, I'm on the side of you should be put to death. I really am. And I don't mean hanging. I don't mean any kind of torture or electric chair. A lethal injection. It's quick. They've gone. I'm not interested in the violence of the whole anything at all. And I know people think that I'm very wrong, but if it was my child and someone had a lethal injection, I would be happy with that. It's a lot better than what they've done to those children that they've murdered. If they're put to death, there is never any chance of them coming out of prison. And of course, you would have to be as much as 100% possible sure that that person is the person that did the crime, because yes, we do have corruption sometimes, and yes, they do get it wrong sometimes, but when they're absolutely 100% sure that that person is the killer, why should they be allowed left to live?
Do you believe in rehabilitation though? Because there are theories, or there are people who believe that sometimes murderers may also have their own mental health issues that drive them to become violent, and death penalty is not the solution. So rehabilitation might and treatment might be a better way to go for these cases. What do you think?
It's difficult because there are so many different ways of saying that someone's got mental illness these days. There's also a huge amount of support in the community with people that have have mental illness, real mental illness. And then you've got people who are prone to violence all their life. Yes, they might come from a violent home. It always amazes me that if people live with violence, that they continue it on and they don't break the chain. But I guess that's about education and support. But for me, if you've murdered someone, you don't deserve to live. So rehabilitation, yes, in cases of other crimes. I have lost someone in my own family, a small child who was murdered. I'm not going to go into the case, but the man did get a life sentence and he will never come out. But in the court case, it came out that it wasn't the first time he'd been violent. I think he was in his 40s. When he was only 16, he attacked somebody and left them very severely injured. And then, had he gone to prison then, or had he been more severely punished and spent a longer time, had he had rehabilitation, would he have killed the little boy in our family? We don't know. But there are too many people that have committed murder and come out and murdered again.
So we have almost come to the end of our show. So before we go, is there any message you'd like to convey to people or violent crime survivors who are experiencing PTSD but are just too ashamed or too scared to get help?
Don't be scared. There are so many different people out there that can help you now. There's endless places to go. Sometimes you have to go on a waiting list, but really push for that help, because you're never going to get over the trauma of losing your child. Nobody ever does. But you can learn to live again for the rest of your family. And they need help too. They need family support. There must be a position where the whole family can come together, because some people have got a lot of children, they're all off in different directions and they all fall apart. There is no stigma attached anymore. We have to really make it okay to not be okay, and people bandy those words around all the time, but it is so important. There is no shame in getting help. Everybody has to just talk, really talk, and stop being scared of what people are saying. But again, the press don't help. When someone's not well because they've got PTSD, they're scared to ask for help because of the stigma, and the press rip people apart. If anyone's behaving in the slightly oddest way, they don't say, "Oh, what's the matter with him?" They rip you apart in the press. And even like celebrities, people say, "So what about celebrities?" But they are bringing PTSD to the front because they're celebrities, they get the news, and that must filter down to other people to think, well, if they can, I can. And it's not all about money. It's about finding a way forward so you don't sit and destroy the whole of the rest of your life. There is no shame in having mental illness.
All right. Thank you, Dee, for this interview. I've learned so much from you today. So to my audience, what I'd like to say is, if you have been a victim of a violent crime, if you're a violent crime survivor, and you're experiencing symptoms of trauma, don't be afraid, don't be ashamed to ask for help. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, and also if you feel like it's getting overwhelming, then there are avenues for you to explore to get treatment. Okay, everyone, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell to get alerts on my future videos. And if there are anybody else or any other topics on mental health that you'd like me to touch on, in this series, do comment below. All right, everyone. Thank
Thank you
you
very
for
much.
watching. Bye.